1. d4 immediately stakes a claim in the center, controlling key squares and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development of white's minor pieces. This move, knight to f6, is a flexible and sound response to white's d4, preparing to develop a piece while controlling central squares and maintaining various opening options. Developing a knight to f3 supports the pawn on e4 and prepares for castling, maintaining flexibility in the early setup. This move initiates the queen's Indian defense, aiming to fianchetto the bishop to b7 to exert pressure on the central squares and the queenside. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop to g2, controlling the long diagonal and supporting the central pawn structure for a flexible setup against black's intended queen's bishop development. Developing the bishop to b7 prepares to challenge white's g3 pawn structure and potentially exert pressure on the long diagonal. This move completes white's fianchetto, developing the bishop to a powerful diagonal to pressure black's queenside and prepare for castling. This move challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and create dynamic counterplay. Castling kingside is a sound prophylactic move, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks, while also allowing the g2 bishop to maintain influence on the long diagonal after the central tension resolves. By capturing the central pawn, black clarifies the center and aims to challenge white's space advantage, opening lines for their pieces. This recapture immediately opens the d-file for white's rook and maintains central pawn presence, a common positional goal in these queen's Indian structures. This move, known as the exchange variation in some queen's pawn openings, simplifies the position by trading off a bishop for a knight, immediately impacting the pawn structure and potentially opening lines for the rooks. The king's capture of the bishop on g2 is a critical decision that opens up the g-file and allows the king to participate in the game, though it also creates potential weaknesses around the king later on. Black's capture and subsequent central pawn thrust on d5 challenges white's queen's pawn and aims to open lines for their pieces, often leading to a fluid pawn structure. This move challenges black's central pawn on d5, aiming to open lines and exploit the king's exposed position after the capture on g2. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, aiming to contest white's central control and potential queenside expansion. This move forces the black king to move, disrupting black's central pawn structure and potentially weakening the king's position. This move is crucial for developing the queen to a safer square and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority. This move boldly challenges black's queen, forcing it to move and aiming to disrupt black's central control and development. This move develops a piece, reinforces the d5 pawn, and prepares to contest the central squares, a common theme in this queen's Indian setup. This move opens the c-file and challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to create imbalances and potentially attack on the queenside with the knight now free from its pawn defense. This recapture re-establishes central pawn presence and opens the diagonal for the queen, preparing to challenge white's central control and develop pieces with tempo. This move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to control the important d6 diagonal and prepare for potential pressure against black's central pawn structure. This move decisively claims the open c-file, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially pressure the c3 pawn. This move strategically centralizes the rook, contesting the open c-file and preparing to apply pressure against black's queenside pawns and potentially the c6 knight. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, challenging white's knight and preparing to reinforce black's central pawn structure. This move aggressively expands on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially dislodge black's well-placed bishop. Black captures a pawn and opens the a-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. This move sacrifices the exchange to gain significant positional pressure and open lines for attack against black's king. This capture on c6, though seemingly materializing, unfortunately opens the c-file for white's rook and gives up black's strong bishop on circa 5, likely leading to a positional disadvantage for black. This capture regains material equality after the exchange sacrifice, but opens the c-file for black and creates an imbalance of minor pieces as white now has an extra pawn against black's active bishop. This move introduces a strong central knight outpost on e4, challenging white's pawn structure and preparing to exploit the newly opened central files. This knight maneuver strategically repositions the knight to defend the c4 pawn and prepare for future pawn advances, aiming to restrict black's queenside play while supporting white's central control. This move exchanges the knight for the bishop, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create weaknesses in their pawn structure. After the recapture, while also opening up the d-file for black's rooks, the recapture of the knight with the queen solidifies white's central pawn presence and maintains queen activity on a more flexible square, preparing for potential advances in the center. After a sharp queen sacrifice and pawn exchange, white has a material advantage, so black aims to consolidate their position and activate their king by castling. This move prepares to contest the open d-file and potentially coordinate a central pawn push with the eventual support of the queen and rook. This move repositions the rook to the 5th rank, preparing to challenge white's control of the open c-file and potentially create counterplay along that critical axis. This knight maneuver aims to control the central squares and potentially attack the weak pawn on d5, while also preparing for future action along the open c-file. This move repositions the rook to the open e-file, supporting potential pawn pushes and preparing to contest the center if white's pieces become disorganized. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, indirectly challenging black's rook on c5 and preparing to potentially attack weaknesses on the queenside or centralize further. This move reorganizes the rooks to defend the pawn on c5 and prepare for potential operations on the kingside. This move prepares to consolidate white's queenside pawns and potentially free the d-file for future rook activity, while also reinforcing the kingside. This move activates the queen to potentially pressure white's queenside pawns and centralize, while also preparing to contest the open c-file and challenge white's knight. This move removes black's advanced knight and simplifies the position, aiming to exploit white's material advantage after the exchange, though black now has an open c-file. This move initiates an aggressive counterattack, aiming to exploit the vulnerable state of white's kingside and disrupt white's queen by placing black's rook on an active, penetrating square. The rook is repositioned to defend the newly created open file and prevent black's queen from further infiltration. Black's sacrifice of the rook on a2 is an attempt to disrupt white's king safety and activate their own remaining pieces, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and potentially create counterplay. White recaptures the rook, simplifying into an endgame where the rook on the 2nd rank now offers greater activity and control over the crucial d-file. Capturing the rook on a2 was a forced sequence after white's blunder. But now black must be vigilant. as white has recouped material and aims to exploit the open lines against black's king. This move recaptures the pawn and centralizes the queen, aiming to exploit white's weakened pawn structure and potential attacking opportunities on the kingside while also preparing to contest the open c-file. This move develops the rook to a more active square, supporting the f7 pawn and preparing to defend the kingside if necessary. This move aims to centralize the knight, attacking the rook on c2 and preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a central pawn push. This move shifts the king to a safer square, anticipating potential threats along the g-file and preparing to connect the rooks for coordinated defense. This move b5 repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support potential pawn pushes and control key diagonals, while simultaneously defending the d4 pawn. This move is a crucial defensive maneuver to break the pin on the g7 pawn and prepare for potential counterplay on the kingside, as the bishop on e5 is a dangerous attacking piece. This move actively re-engages the knight, threatening to penetrate the kingside and exploit the vulnerable f6 pawn. The move 29, rg8 aims to centralize the rook and prepare for potential defensive or offensive actions on the kingside, while also freeing up the g8 square for potential future piece maneuvers. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it supports potential pawn advances and defends the king's flank, while also keeping an eye on black's king. This move addresses the potential discovered attack on the king by white's bishop and knight should the g-pawn advance, creating a necessary defensive screen. This move creates potential space for the king on the kingside and supports a future pawn push to break open lines if the opportunity arises. The move qb1 re-establishes pressure on the queenside, forcing white to decide how to address the potential weaknesses and looking to centralize the queen for future activity. This move is a decisive tactical breakthrough, sacrificing a knight to create an unstoppable passed pawn and a mating attack by exposing the black king. This move continues black's defensive strategy of centralizing the queen and preparing to counterattack the weakened white king, while also aiming to defend the g7 pawn. This pawn push advances the attack on the kingside, creating immediate threats and potentially opening lines for further piece activity against black's exposed monarch. This move is a crucial defensive maneuver, repositioning the queen to support the king and prepare for potential threats while also guarding the f6 pawn from further pressure. This knight maneuver aims to reposition to a more active square, potentially eyeing the weakened kingside pawn structure after black's queen moved away. This move allows the king to escape the dangerous open g-file and potentially find safety on the dark squares, while white's knight on f5 is also threatened by the queen on f7. The move k4 offers a strong centralization of the queen, preparing to contest control of the d6 square and potentially create threats against black's king. On the kingside, this move aims to consolidate the rook on the active e-file, preparing for potential defenses against white's active queen and knight and looking to contest the open file. This move activates the queen, preparing to support a pawn push on the kingside and potentially create threats against black's king, while also keeping an eye on black's advanced rook on the 7th rank. The queen retreats to safety, creating a defensive screen for the king and preparing to support potential pawn pushes on the kingside. nd6 re-establishes pressure on the f7 square, aiming to exploit black's exposed king and potentially force material concessions or decisive attacking opportunities. The rook on e7 defends the knight on e6 and prepares to support the king should it need to move from the dangerous h-file. This move effectively removes a key defender of the black king and opens up lines for a decisive attack, exploiting the weakened kingside pawn structure. This check forces white's king into a precarious central position, potentially allowing black to consolidate their material advantage and coordinate an attack on the exposed monarch. This move aims to consolidate the pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances in the center or kingside, while also securing the king from further checks along the a8-h1 diagonal. This move sacrifices the rook on g7 to prevent the powerful pawn promotion and aims to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially open lines for counterplay against the now exposed king. This move exchanges a powerful bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit white's exposed king and the potential for a passed pawn push on the queenside. The king must escape the center after white's queen sacrifice, moving to a safer square like g7 or h8 to avoid immediate tactical threats. This knight check initiates a decisive sequence where white forces the black king into a discovered attack on the d-file, leading to the inevitable loss of the queen. This move repositions the king to a more secure square, away from the immediate threats posed by white's knight and rook, while preparing to defend against the ongoing attack on the kingside. This forcing check is a key defensive move, leveraging the open diagonal to prevent the black king from escaping to g7 and to reposition the white queen for further activity.